Palimpsest. Any writing surface on which an earlier writing has been erased or effaced and a later writing inscribed or overlaid on that surface, often with the traces of the former inscription appearing underneath. Panopticon. Though originally an optical instrument or device, the word has entered critical discourse through Michel Foucault's appropriation of the term from the writings of Jeremy Bentham, who employed it to define circular prison structures with cells arranged around a central courtyard in which prisoners can be observed at all times. Foucault extends the idea of the panopticon to include a number of social forms of surveillance in hospitals, asylums and so on. Parapraxis. Freudian term, denoting inadvertent slips of the tongue or pen as revealed symptoms of psychic disturbance. The subject or analysand, intending to say or write one thing, says or writes something else which has been repressed. Paradigm. A pattern, model or exemplary case. Parody. A written imitation of an author's work, following closely the tone or style of the original, but reworked so as to produce comic or inappropriate effect. Pathetic fallacy. Term coined by John Ruskin to signify the attribution of nature with human emotions and qualities, or the displacement of a psychic condition onto natural phenomena such as atmospherics. Patriarchy. Literally the rule of the father. Patriarchy is the name given to the whole complex system of male dominance by which most societies are run now and were run in the past. Patriarchy includes the systematic exclusion of women from rights of inheritance, to education, the vote, equal pay, equal rights before the law. It also includes the ways in which even more liberal regimes tend to leave women out of structures of power, even when they claim to be regimes based on equality. Performative. The act of public exhibition that results in a transaction between performer and audience, an utterance that, via its public display, causes a linguistic interaction with the exhibition's object. The condition of performative articulation is given particular consideration by Jacques Derrida in the context of the instability of speech acts. Derrida's analysis of the performative and signature event context comes as a response to the work of speech act theorist J. L. Austin, who distinguishes between constative and performative or illocutionary utterances, the former being an assertion or description, the latter being an utterance which allows us to do something by means of speech itself. In Bodies That Matter. On the Discourse of Limits of Sex, 1993, Judith Butler identifies performative speech acts as forms of authoritative speech. Most performatives, for instance, are statements that, in the uttering, also perform a certain action and exercise a binding power. Derrida's critique, on which Butler draws, is built on his understanding that an utterance is never stable, but always available for citation and iterability, and, indeed, only aspires to communicability and being transmissible, repeatable, beyond its supposedly original context, which itself is never self-sufficient. Thus, the idea of a speech act is already troubled by the iterable condition of the sign. Phallic. Relating to or resembling the phallus, a symbol of generative power, refers to an interest in the phallus or a masculinist point of view. In psychoanalysis, a reference to particular stage in male development when the subject is preoccupied with the genitals. Phallic primacy. Concept often associated with Freud's castration complex, phallic primacy refers to the presence of male genitalia and its impact upon psychosocial relations. Phallocentrism. Privileging of a masculinist, specifically unitary, singular, point of view in terms of individuals, institutions or cultures. Certain strands of feminist criticism aim to offer critiques, exposing the phallocentric assumptions of a text. Such feminist criticism examines the ways in which phallocentrism, most fundamentally organized around the binary opposition of man-woman, operates through an economy of sexual difference, which is hierarchical rather than equivalent in relationship. Phallocratism. The institutionalization and hegemony of a masculinist perspective. In the parlance of French feminist Louise Rigaud, Phallocratism refers to the often masculinized division of labor that exists between the sexes. Phallogocentrism, neologism, coined by Jacques Derrida, in order to suggest how logocentric thought or discourse, in being organized around a supposedly central truth or concept, is also phallocentric, that is to say, it orientates itself and its subjects to that center, as the sole center or implied origin, presence or authority from which all other terms, concepts and ideas derive their meaning, whether semantically, epistemologically or theologically. Phantasm, a mental image, the product of fantasy, the imagination or delusion, imaginary projections or visualizations, images arising from the unconscious. Louis Althusser observes in his reading of the Freudian concept of the phantasm that, inasmuch as the phantasm is a figure for desire, it thus operates metaphorically. Phenomenology, philosophical discourse founded by German philosopher Edmund Husserl, that maintains that objects attain meaning through their perception in a given person's consciousness. Philology, though rarely used in this sense now, philology signifies the love of literature. More broadly, it referred to the study, interpretation and criticism of literature, though this meaning is now also rare. Phoneme, the basic sound unit of pronunciation in language. English, for example, includes 45 phonemes. Phonocentrism, neologism coined by Jacques Derrida in Of Grammatology, by which he identifies the tendency in philosophy and linguistics to privilege speech and the voice as guarantors of truth and presence, self-presence and self-consciousness over writing, which signifies absence and may be open to misinterpretation. Pleasure principle. Pleasure refers to a state of gratification, particularly in terms of delight or sensual fulfillment. Freud names the pleasure principle the psychic drive after gratification, which has to be repressed in order that humans can function in the social world. Jacques Lacan develops a distinction between pleasure and jouissance, with the pleasure principle naming a symbolic law which, in Lacan's words, regulates the whole functioning of his psychic apparatuses. Jouissance, on the other hand, is disruptive rather than regulatory. Pluralism, variety of approach and assumption. A pluralist approach to criticism is one that has many different methods and assumptions at its disposal, rather than an approach that imposes a single model on all texts, no matter what the circumstances. What is significant about critical pluralism is that the various positions which any pluralist discourse brings together are not significantly at odds with one another, and that pluralism often signals an implicit, if not explicit, consensus. Point to Capiton, phrase employed by Jacques Lacan, usually translated as quilting, anchoring or suturing point. Taken from embroidery, the phrase indicates for Lacan moments in the psyche where signifier and signified are gathered or stitched together, thereby momentarily bringing to a halt the slip page of signification by which subjectivity is constituted. Polysemy, relating to the possibility of a simultaneous multiplicity of meaning encoded within a single phrase or text. Positivism, philosophical theory, formulated by Auguste Comte, which privileges observable facts and phenomena over modes of knowledge such as theology and metaphysics. Post, the notion as signaled in terms such as postmodernism, post-Marxism, post-structuralism or post-theory of an intellectual moment that ensues after the occurrence of a paradigm shift or epistemological transition of sorts. In addition to denoting the pastness of a given intellectual or cultural epoch, post suggests the persistence of enduring philosophical quandaries and discoveries associated with such historical or theoretical moments, which the notion of postism hints are not, in fact, over but which haunt or disturb the progressivist sense of having apparently moved beyond particular modes of inquiry. Postmodernism. There is little general consensus concerning the meaning of the term, and its use in history is checkered. Its earliest appearances date back to the first decades of the 20th century, as critics such as Perry Anderson and Frederick Jameson discuss in their work on postmodernism. It has also been used extensively in the field of architecture as the name for a school or movement. With reference to literature and culture, postmodernism is often taken to refer to any work of art which knowingly refers to its own status as a work of art, or which otherwise, from the position as elite art form, jokingly addresses the status of the art object through construction from a reference to popular culture, thereby collapsing distinctions between high and low. However, certain theorists of the postmodern, such as Frederick Jameson, Jean-François Lyotard and Teresa Ebert, find it problematic of defining postmodernism, a question of its being a product of particular political overdeterminations, which serve to produce postmodernism's often apparently contradictory meanings, and whereby the postmodern condition is fundamentally misrecognized in aesthetic terms. The meaning or identity of the postmodern is understood, then, as a self-conscious aesthetic component of its constitution, rather than as a political effect of late 20th century global capitalism. There is therefore a shift in definition from the formalist aesthetic radicalism perceived by William Spinoza, for example, to a more politically or ideologically comprehended aspect, to what we call postmodernism. Postmodernity. Term referring to the era, state of being or literary arts associated with postmodernism. Jean-François Lyotard defines postmodernity as being marked by a suspicion of grand narratives. The idea of a postmodern era is also one provisionally defined by the advent of technologies, the emergence of globalization and post-industrial society, and the power of the image and simulacrum within consumer culture, where images such as the Coke or Nike logos assume greater significance in themselves than any real product or reality to which they might refer. Power. In the work of Michel Foucault, power constitutes one of the three axes constitutive of subjectification, the other two being ethics and truth. For Foucault, power implies knowledge, and vice versa. However, power is causal. It is constitutive of knowledge, even while knowledge is, concomitantly, constitutive of power. Knowledge gives one power, but one has the power in given circumstances to constitute bodies of knowledge, discourses and so on as valid or invalid, truthful or untruthful. Power serves in making the world both knowable and controllable. Yet, the nature of power, as Foucault suggests, is essentially prescriptive, concerned more with imposing limits on its subjects. Praxis. Term adopted by Karl Marx in 1844 to denote social activity by which political theory or philosophy becomes social and historical actuality. Presentism. Refers to a radical overemphasis or privileging of the present over what is perceived to be a less culturally and technologically effectual past. Primal Horde. Primal scene. That which is primal refers in Freudian psychoanalysis to the desires, fears, needs and anxieties, constitutive of the origins of the subject psyche. The idea of the primal horde signifies an originary human social collective. The primal scene is that moment in Freudianism when the infant subject becomes aware of sexual relations between its parents. Projection. In psychoanalytic discourse, the transference of desire or fantasy onto another person, object or situation, in order to avoid the recognition of the subject's responsibility for his or her behavior or actions. Prosopopoeia. Literally meaning to make or give face, a rhetorical figure by which an abstract idea or concept is given human form, or otherwise the representation of an imaginary or absent person, as if he or she were speaking. Pseudo-statement. Concept often associated with British formalist I.A. Richards, which refers to a spurious utterance dominated by emotion and lacking in referential truth. According to Richards, such a statement finds its origins in human impulses and attitudes, rather than in generally accepted notions of truth.